Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
We're doing a deep dive into an era that really, it completely reshaped American culture, finance, crime, everything. Miami in the 1980s.
Right. And when people hear cocaine cowboys, they think of the flash, the cars, the nightlife.
Pastel suits.
Exactly. But that was all just a symptom. It was a time defined by a literal, visible flood of cash. And to understand that explosion, you have to look at the engine that was fueling it all, the Medellin Cartel.
That's it. And we're going past the glossy headlines today, past the Hollywood myths. Our mission is to trace this empire from the ground up, using the source material, the raw, candid accounts of the people who actually built this machine.
We're talking about the pilots who risked their lives on every single flight, the traffickers who managed, mountains of cash. We're going to look at the entire infrastructure that moved the product from these remote jungles in South America straight through the heart of Florida and onto the streets all across the U.S.
That's the mission. We are documenting the entire vertical integration. I mean, the supply chain logistics alone are incredible. The staggering profits, the money laundering systems that built what was essentially a terrifyingly successful multinational corporation.
It really was.
So as the historian in this conversation, I want to focus on that organizational framework, the geopolitical context. How was this company, for lack of a better word, actually conceived and structured?
And I'll take us inside that machine. What did it feel like? What were the specific risks, the astronomical dollar amounts that drove these people, and of course the very real, very high human cost of these operations? We'll be citing testimony from figures like the pilot Roger Reeves, smuggler Mickey Monday, cartel accountants, the people who are actually on the ground.
It's so vital to start right at the beginning because the origin story of the Medellin cocaine trade, it really doesn't fit that typical narcos gangster narrative that we all see in the media.
Not at all. It didn't start with, street violence in Colombia.
No, it started with businessmen, people who saw a market opportunity.
Absolutely. The source material really emphasizes this critical point. The original operation was started by 4 individuals from Medellin who were already entrenched in Miami.
They already had a foothold.
A huge one. They weren't bootstrapping criminals. These were entrepreneurs. They had existing, legitimate businesses, which gave them the perfect cover, established financial routes. They viewed this whole thing, cocaine trafficking, as just a sophisticated supply chain problem that was ripe for vertical ownership.
And there was a central figure in that early Miami trade, right? The operative who was really the boss on the U.S. side.
Manny, he was the guy. And what's so fascinating about this setup is that it wasn't this sudden, chaotic influx of drugs. It was a deliberate, highly organized market entry built on networks that were already there.
To understand their innovation, though, you have to look at the timeline. Because, and this is crucial, before 1980, Colombia itself was not producing cocaine.
That's the key piece of the puzzle that so often gets missed. It's so important. If you trace the supply chain all the way back, the raw material, the coca base, which they called pasta, was coming exclusively out of Bolivia and Peru.
So what was Colombia's role then?
Their initial revolutionary role wasn't agriculture, it was chemistry.
They were refining the product. They were the factory floor.
Exactly. They would import this coca base and then perform the intricate and really dangerous crystallization process to turn that base into pure, marketable cocaine hydrochloride.
Which immediately gave them what we'd call end-to-end control.
Yes, vertical integration right from the very beginning. They owned the refinement process, and that was the most profitable link in the entire chain back then.
When you talk about crystallization, we're not just talking about like drying leaves in the sun. This is real chemistry with real risks.
Oh, absolutely. This is a technical detail, but it's crucial. To do that conversion, you needed enormous quantities of what they call precursor chemicals. Things like ether, acetone, potassium permanganate, hydrochloric acid. I mean, these are industrial-grade chemicals. They're hard to handle, they're flammable, and using them in large quantities is an immediate red flag for any kind of illicit operation.
And the labs themselves, I imagine they weren't exactly state-of-the-art.
Not even close. You have to picture these labs deep in the jungle or in some remote farmhouse. They weren't sophisticated clean rooms. The process was inherently toxic.
So the safety standards were, what, 0?
Non-existent. The people actually working in these refinement labs, the cooks, they faced severe health risks from just breathing the fumes. The sheer volume of dangerous solvents being used meant the whole environment was volatile. It was a constant explosion hazard.
But by taking on that refinement role, the Medellin Group accepted that risk because the payout was it was too big to ignore.
It justified everything. It cemented their role as the global manufacturer. They owned the finished product.
And once they established themselves as the factory, their partnership strategy was equally shrewd. They needed a secure, massive supply of that raw pasta.
So they partnered with the source, key suppliers, like Roberto Suarez in Bolivia.
Suarez. He was the real commodity king in Bolivia, right? The king of cocaine there.
That was his title. He controlled the coca fields, the initial processing of the leaves into paste. He's actually, by the way, the figure who is directly referenced in the movie Scarface.
Wow. It sounds like that partnership really established a secure foundation for them. It guaranteed quality control and, more importantly, quantity.
It was a true collaboration. You had the resource and you had the refinement. The Colombian groups depended entirely on Suarez for the base material. A trafficker recalled that when he flew down for a major deal, the one that later got him captured, it was brokered specifically through Roberto Suarez in Bolivia.
So it wasn't just about buying from him, it was a deep partnership.
It had to be. Think about the logistics. The Colombians had to organize the flow of those precursor chemicals to Bolivia to make sure Suarez could even deliver the paste. And then they had to organize the transport of the paste out of Bolivia to the Colombian labs. It was this massive continental logistical challenge before the product even left South America.
So they're building this huge corporate structure, they're refining the product, securing raw materials, establishing a foothold in Miami. And all of this is happening while U.S. law enforcement is sort of scrambling to catch up.
And law enforcement was active, even in those early years. The source material talks about the 1978 Video Canary case in Miami.
What was that?
It was a major sting operation, one of the earliest high-profile busts, and it arrested a lot of people who were dealing cocaine in the area.
Now, a major federal case like that, you'd think it would stop a smaller organization dead in its tracks. How did the Medellin families react to these early setbacks?
They viewed them as operating costs, just the cost of doing business, not as existential threats. The business model was just so incredibly robust, and the demand in the U.S. was accelerating so quickly that they just absorbed these busts.
They replaced the captured guys and just kept going.
They replaced the operatives and continued to expand their total control, their vertical integration over the entire process, the business potential just.
Yeah.
It far outweighed the early risks of arrest or losing a shipment here and there.
That total end-to-end control meant they had just unprecedented authority over pricing and supply. If you look at the raw numbers that are cited by former traffickers, the profit margin is it's staggering. And it perfectly explains why all those risks we just talked about were deemed worth taking.
Let's really lay out the price structure, because this is where the genius and, frankly, the horror of the operation really intersect. The cartel's cost of goods. The raw production cost for a single kilo of cocaine in Medellin was incredibly low.
How low are we talking?
We're talking around 2,000 American dollars per kilo. Some insiders even suggest that, when you factor in the cost of the pasta and the chemicals, the base production cost could be as low as $500 a kilo for a full shipment.
Okay. So, best case, $500. Let's say average $2,000 a kilo on the factory floor in Colombia. Now, watch what happens to that investment as it crosses the border.
This is the magic of the markup. That same $2,000 kilo could be sold wholesale in Los Angeles for $30,000. Sometimes it would push as high as $35,000, depending on the route and, if there was a scarcity in the market.
I'm doing the math here. That's a 1,400 to 1,700% return on investment. And that's just wholesale.
And that's before they even hit the global market. If the product made it all the way across the Atlantic, say to Madrid, Europe was even hungrier. That kilo could fetch anywhere from $60,000 to $70,000.
It just becomes this premium luxury commodity the further it gets from the source.
Exactly. And the street value tells the rest of the story. At the source, it costs maybe $2 a gram to produce. That turns into roughly $100 a gram on the U.S. street once it's cut and sold in small quantities.
That kind of profit density is what allowed them to scale so incredibly fast. They could finance their entire infrastructure, planes, pilots, bribes, enforcement, off the profit margin of a single, 300-kilo shipment.
It really is wild when you compare it to today. One former trafficker noted that a 300-kilo load back then, in the late 70s or early 80s, which would be considered, small potatoes in modern trafficking.
Or a drop in the bucket now.
That small load could generate a pure profit that was equivalent to moving 2,000 kilos today.
Why? Just because the price was so high?
Because the original wholesale price point in the U.S. was just that high. There was no competition, and the quality was pristine. The market was wide open.
It almost sounds too easy, but you mentioned something else, an operational method that amplified their advantage even more, selling on credit.
This is a sophisticated corporate strategy, and they applied it to crime. A trafficker recalled that they stood to make a profit of $50,000 per kilo on a 300-kilo shipment. But the crucial detail was that often half, or sometimes more, of that merchandise was sold on credit to their U.S. distributors.
Which means they're reducing their own upfront capital risk. They're accelerating their cash flow because they don't have to wait for the product to be sold on the street before they get paid.
Exactly. But it also sounds incredibly risky, right? Selling on credit in the criminal underworld.
Yeah, how on earth did they enforce payment?
Well, that's where the violence became an integrated business function. When you sell 150 kilos of cocaine on credit, you are essentially lending a U.S. distributor, what, $4.5–5 million?
A huge amount of money.
If that distributor defaults, the Medellin Cartel doesn't take you to court. Enforcement was swift, it was brutal, and it was very, very public. The violence that we associate with the cocaine cowboys era in Miami, it wasn't random. It was primarily debt collection and market enforcement. It was to make sure that those credit payments flowed back to the center of the organization.
The sheer scale of movement is what created this mythical reputation. It wasn't just the profit per kilo, it was the overwhelming volume.
Oh, yeah. We have accounts from smugglers who boast about bringing in 700 tons, not kilos, tons of product over their careers. That level of sheer, unbelievable volume is what distinguished Medellin. It's what defined the cocaine influx into the U.S. and pushed Miami past saturation and into a state of, well, financial chaos.
Now, to understand Medellin's unique position, it's helpful to briefly contrast their model with their primary rivals at the time, the Cali Cartel. Their structures were fundamentally different.
Very different. Medellin, as we've established, was the whole soup-to-nuts operation. Vertically integrated, they controlled production, refinement, and they maintained direct oversight of the distribution chain right into the U.S. market.
And Cali, how did they approach the same problem?
The Cali model, according to the accounts we have, was more decentralized. It was almost like they were operating like a sophisticated trade brokerage in those early days.
So less hands-on with the logistics of actually moving the product.
Right. Their deals often involve brokering these large transactions in neutral locations, like Panama. You'd have Central American partners sending the dollars to the Colombian capo to pay for the merchandise.
So they're relying more on intermediaries and trust.
Exactly. And to manage that trust, they used a system that involved a partner in a neutral country, like Honduras, who would act as the guarantee man.
Okay, that's a specific piece of jargon. What exactly did the guarantee man do? What did he guarantee?
The guarantee man was essential for managing risk in this kind of dispersed cash-only system. They would guarantee either the safety of the cash delivery to the capo, or they'd guarantee the purity of the product once it reached the middleman, or sometimes both.
So they were like an escrow service for the underworld.
That's a perfect way to put it. They would hold a portion of the cash or the product until both parties confirmed they were satisfied. It reduced the risk of somebody just stealing the money or delivering bad product. It was a more conservative, broker-focused approach, relying on these trusted third parties rather than the total vertical ownership that Medellin always preferred.
So while Medellin was focused on owning the entire factory and the retail store, Cali was focused on secure third-party brokering. And that difference would become really critical later on when law enforcement tried to dismantle them.
It made all the difference in the world.
Okay, so once the product was refined, priced, the corporate structure was in place. The next huge challenge was logistics, the execution. If Medellin was the factory, the distribution routes primarily ran through Florida, and that quickly turned Miami into the central hub, the indispensable bottleneck for the entire U.S. cocaine market.
And logistics, back then, meant both air and sea. Historically, the initial method for moving massive volumes, especially precursor stuff like marijuana that financed the early operations, that was all sea transport. This involved what they called motherships.
Describe the scale of these. We're not talking about a small yacht here.
No. We're talking massive deep-sea vessels that could carry enormous loads, sometimes 40 tons of marijuana. The product would be covered in bales, stacked so high that often only the boat's radar was visible above the payload.
And they'd sail right up to the U.S. coast.
Right up to the edges of U.S. territorial waters or to key points in the Caribbean. And the risk here wasn't just law enforcement, it was the sheer inefficiency of the transfer process. Well, these motherships would anchor off the coast, and they'd be met by smaller, faster boats, often high-speed fishing vessels, crab boats they call them. And this transfer process was just agonizingly slow and risky.
You're just sitting there
For
exposed.
hours, it could take several hours just to run the distance from the mothership to the coast and offload the product. The bigger the load, the longer you sat out there in the open. You needed perfect weather and absolutely no interference for hours on end to move 40 tons of anything.
So the sea route was cumbersome. As the volume and demand for cocaine exploded, they needed a faster, more dependable method.
And that's where air transport came in. And with it, the core element of immense human risk, the cocaine pilots.
The pilots, figures like Roger Reeves, Mickey Monday,
Yeah.
they became these legendary, almost mythical figures.
They were the essential, but also completely expendable component of the whole machine. They were required for the rapid delivery that justified that enormous wholesale markup. But because of the high turnover, the mechanical risks, the danger of interception, they were always treated as replaceable assets.
What were the actual challenges of the flight itself? I mean, it's not like they were filing flight plans and landing at Miami International.
Absolutely not. You have to imagine they're flying low, often in single-engine planes like Cessnas, and they're overloaded far beyond their safety specs. They had to navigate without communication or with corrupted communication and land on these makeshift controlled airstrips deep in the jungle or on tiny unlit islands.
And refueling must have been a nightmare.
A massive operational risk. If the local refueling crew didn't show up or if the plane had a mechanical issue, you were just stranded in hostile territory with a plane full of cocaine.
And the source material provides a terrifying account of what happened when those risks finally caught up to one of these pilots. It details the experience of Roger Reeves after he was captured by Mexican federal police.
His experience is a chilling illustration of the true cost of doing this business. Reeves detailed being held in conditions of just extreme deprivation and torture. He was held in this tiny confined cell, maybe 5 by 5 feet, nothing but a cement floor. The conditions were specifically designed to break a person, physically and psychologically.
Let's expand on the specifics of the interrogation because it really highlights the brutality that was just normalized when a pilot fell out of the system.
He recounted being subjected to this method designed to inflict maximum pain and panic. They forced him to inhale something so noxious, probably a chemical irritant or a highly concentrated solvent, that he said he felt like it blew my head off.
My God.
His entire survival strategy, he said, was based on learning how to hold his breath for as long as humanly possible, because he knew that the moment he exhaled, he'd have to inhale that poison again.
That is just pure sensory torture. And this wasn't happening in some quiet, isolated room.
No, he described the constant psychological strain of being forced to stand over a barrel with his arms pulled far across his back, this excruciating position, while hearing the sounds of other prisoners being brutally beaten and tortured just outside the cell walls.
So the message was clear. This is what's coming for you.
That's it. And the cartel structure, it just normalized this. The organization focused on the balance sheet. That $50,000 profit per kilo justified treating the pilot as a disposable asset, a necessary sacrifice to protect the flow of product and information.
That account perfectly bridges the organizational efficiency of the cartel, that highly refined corporate machine, with the raw, visceral, brutal reality on the ground.
It was all a financial calculation. Replacing a pilot and a plane, or allowing a captured pilot to endure that kind of treatment. It was just a line item on the ledger of operational risk.
And you have to wonder how the pilots rationalized that.
Well, they were highly skilled, high-risk contractors. They were paid astronomical sums for a single trip, sums they never would have seen in legitimate aviation. But they lived with the constant knowledge that if they went down, they were entirely on their own. The cartel didn't send rescue missions, they just sent replacement pilots.
The success of that pipeline, then, relied entirely on the distribution network on the U.S. side. And this is where Miami became the epicenter, the absolutely crucial nucleus, not just for moving product in, but for reversing that flow and getting the cash out.
And we have to re-emphasize the importance of Rafa, who's often implied in the context of figures like Jorge Valdez in consolidating that Miami operation. He's often credited with taking the Medellin Cartel beyond just being the manufacturer and the long-haul distributor.
So Rafa's contribution was really about integrating the cartel into the U.S. market. Full circle, he established the operation right down to the retail level.
Yes. He oversaw the entire Miami operation, securing the network of stash houses, managing the local distributors, organizing the retailers. He was, in essence, the founding operational father of the modern cocaine trade in Miami. He managed the logistics from the moment the product hit U.S. soil to the moment the cash was consolidated to be shipped home.
But running the operation in Miami presented this massive, unique challenge that fundamentally shifted the entire criminal ecosystem, something we call the cash problem.
The cash problem.
We're talking about generating literal billions of dollars in U.S. currency that had to be rapidly and efficiently returned to Colombia.
And the logistics of cash transport determined everything about the operation. This cash had to be in the most compact, portable form possible.
$100 bills?
It had to be hundreds.
Walk us through the physical challenge. Why was that so important?
Well, the denomination makes an enormous difference in smuggling efficiency. One operative explained it very plainly. $1 million packed in $100 bills is a relatively small, manageable package. You can fit it into a small suitcase, aligning in a compartment. It's dense, but it's portable.
And if you tried to move that same $1 million in, say, 20s,
In stark contrast, attempting to move $1 million in $20 bills would require a huge duffel bag. It would be exponentially heavier, bulkier, and it would dramatically increase the physical risk of moving it through airports or ports or vehicle checkpoints. The difference between a dense package of hundreds and a huge, unwieldy bag of 20s was the difference between success and failure.
so this need for pristine hundreds must have driven the whole internal operation.
It was so critical that cartel operatives would often test the speed and reliability of their Colombian connections. They'd offer a high-stakes deal, say $1.2 million for 100 kilos, and then they'd demand, "Are you sure there are hundreds?" before they'd finalize the transaction. They needed that guarantee, because if the cash wasn't in hundreds, the whole repatriation process would grind to a halt.
And the sheer volume of cash generated in Miami didn't just sit there. It fueled that notorious cocaine cowboy lifestyle and economy that people like Peggy Rosello and Alex Montanez documented. The money literally sat in vast piles in stash houses.
And the process of moving that cash out led to this rapid evolution of money laundering techniques. The traditional methods just couldn't handle the scale. One trafficker detailed the transition. They would take common, heavy household electronics, specifically video cassette recorders, VCRs.
VCRs.
They'd hollow them out completely, stack the cash inside, seal them back up, and then just ship or mail them out of the country.
I guess because they were bulky, common, and dense enough to hold the weight of the cash without raising suspicion.
They were the perfect Trojan horse of the 1980s. That same trafficker recalled driving up to his house one day only to find over $1 million on my porch waiting for him, stacked inside VCRs that had been shipped via a commercial carrier like UPS.
Wow.
It just illustrates the complete saturation of cash in the system. They were turning a common consumer product into a vessel for billions in illicit funds.
And while that money was waiting for this elaborate packaging process, it financed this unparalleled excess that defined the Miami lifestyle.
That whole cocaine cowboy era, it was defined by conspicuous consumption and, really, hubris. We have accounts of people spending $1,500, $2,000 on suits regularly, living life as ballers, flying first class whenever and wherever they wanted, staying in the best hotels. It wasn't just about making money. It was about demonstrating the ability to spend it limitlessly.
Was that sheer visible excess part of the strategy, or was it just pure hubris that eventually drew too much attention?
A little of both. In the early days, the flashiness acted as a form of social currency, a form of intimidation. It signaled power, untouchability. But as the volume increased, the excess became impossible to hide. And that conspicuous consumption became the very beacon that drew the DEA's eye. When you're driving a Ferrari and paying cash for a $2,000 suit every week, you're basically advertising your illegal profits.
Miami was the ultimate distribution hub. It moved product off those planes and boats and into the broader American networks.
And the profits just continued to flow upstream. For example, the Miami middlemen. They would sell to Harlem wholesalers for $15,000 a kilo. That product would then move onto the street, where the final price was hovering around $22,000. Everyone was getting rich. But that initial low-cost product from Colombia was the engine financing the entire structure. That markup from Miami to Harlem was just another layer of profit built on that initial $2,000 investment.
That immense visibility, created by the scale of the operation and that unimaginable cash flow, it inevitably attracted overwhelming law enforcement pressure from the DEA and the U.S. government. And that's what ultimately began the dismantling of the dynasty.
The government simply couldn't ignore the billions of dollars flooding their economy. And the DEA's strategy had to evolve, because just, catching a plane here or seizing a few kilos there wasn't stopping the flow.
So what did they do?
Their primary strategy, as detailed by former traffickers, focused intensely on targeting high-value informants.
So they weren't just going after the drugs anymore, they were going after the information.
Exactly. It was a classic exchange of leverage. Agents would offer deals to arrested traffickers. The textbook scenario, help us get Maria, or help us take down the big boss, and in exchange, you walk free. Sometimes with no felony charges at all. The goal was no longer the mule. The goal was information that could dismantle the vertical structure from the top down.
And this strategy led to the government building cases that didn't even require physical product. This is a crucial legal shift, moving away from finding the dope to proving the conspiracy.
That's it. Legal charges like possession with intent to distribute and, most powerfully, conspiracy were often based purely on informant testimony and the organization's own financial records, their drug ledgers.
Why was the conspiracy charge so effective for the DEA in taking down these operations?
Well, the legal standard for conspiracy is incredibly powerful. To prove a conspiracy, the government doesn't need to prove that you moved the dope or that you handled the money. They only need to prove two things: that an agreement existed between two or more people to violate drug laws, and that an overt act was committed by any member of that conspiracy in furtherance of the agreement.
And an overt act could be anything.
A simple phone call, a coded message, a ledger entry. That's all it takes.
So the ledgers, the actual books kept by the cartel accountants, they became lethal evidence in this context.
They became the smoking gun that replaced the physical product. We see this play out vividly in the legal accounts. One trafficker was sentenced for 580 kilos based solely on ledgers that were found in a purse and the sworn testimony of informants.
And they never found any drugs on him.
Not a single gram. But the ledger entries, listing the weight, the names, the profit margins, that was sufficient to prove the conspiracy and the weight that was distributed.
Yeah.
The accountants, like the ones in the Jorge Valdez context, suddenly became targets just as dangerous as the capos themselves.
It's important to place this all in the broader geopolitical environment of the 1980s. The U.S. government was treating the cartels as a national security threat by this point.
Absolutely. The war on drugs was fully underway. U.S. tax dollars were already being heavily involved in anti-cartel operations in places like Mexico, funding vehicles, gasoline, weapons programs for local authorities. The entire machinery of the U.S. government was focused on decapitating these highly centralized organizations.
And that centralization, that revolutionary vertical integration we praised at the beginning, that ultimately became Medellин's structural weakness.
It did. The Medellin organization was a traditional, strict hierarchical corporation. If you arrested or killed the leadership, the entire pyramid just crumbled.
Unlike modern cartels.
Right. You contrast that with the models adopted by later groups like the Sinaloa cartel today. They diversified. They utilized a more decentralized, almost freelance or franchise model. Modern cartels are fluid networks, which makes them much harder to decapitate with a single arrest or a targeted killing.
So their vertical control was revolutionary for its time, but it meant they relied completely on stable local alliances in places like Miami to move the product and get the cash back.
And when those alliances fractured, or when operatives decided that the risk of decades in federal prison outweighed their loyalty to the organization, the whole rigid structure was incredibly vulnerable to those federal conspiracy charges. When the center couldn't hold, the perimeter just quickly collapsed.
And ultimately, the narrative comes back to the severe human cost paid by those involved, even the mid-level traffickers or pilots who were just participating in this high-risk corporate venture.
The grim reality of imprisonment is the final chapter of this story. Consider the example of the Virginia kingpin. He got the low end of his guideline, which was 32 years. He had to serve 26 of them, starting at age 33.
A life sentence, effectively.
It is. And his family received immunity in exchange for his cooperation. It just highlights the long-term devastating debt paid by everyone who participated in that high-flying, cash-saturated cocaine cowboy era. The debt collection eventually came, not from the cartel, but from the federal government.
So what does this all mean for the learner who's seeking, quick, thorough knowledge of this period?
I think the key takeaway of the Medellin era is that its success was built on a truly revolutionary, totally integrated business model. A corporate structure that controlled everything from the coca-based crystallization in Colombia right down to wholesale distribution in Miami. They exploited a wide-open market with maximum ruthless efficiency.
But the immense cash flow, the billions of dollars that came flooding back across the border, that also made it an impossibly large, visible target that just couldn't operate in the shadows forever.
and the sheer physical necessity of moving that cash back to Colombia.
Hmm.
I mean, the difference between that small, dense package of hundreds versus the huge, heavy duffel bag of 20s that literally dictated the economics of smuggling. And it fueled the desperate violence required to protect that flow.
And here's the final provocative thought to leave you with, something for you to mull over. The true, enduring legacy of the Medellin era isn't just the product moved or the violence it generated in the 1980s. It's how the unprecedented volume of illegal cash forced the evolution of modern money laundering techniques.
Techniques that are still used today. They're more refined now, but they were born from this era of chaos. By moving billions of dollars in VCRs and suitcases, they forever solidified Miami's status, not just as a distribution hub, but as a critical global financial center for illicit gains. They didn't just move dope, they accelerated the future of financial crime.